The year is 1945, and in a small town on the outskirts of Berlin, the air smells like ash and defeat. The Third Reich is crumbling. Soviet artillery thunders in the distance, getting closer every day, and the streets are filled with desperate refugees fleeing west. But inside a grand requisitioned villa that once belonged to a Jewish banker, the local Gestapo officers are not concerned with the advancing Red Army. They are not packing their files or burning evidence. Instead, they are preparing for a feast. A lavish dinner party has been arranged by their commander to celebrate what he insists will be a temporary retreat, a strategic withdrawal before the inevitable German counteroffensive that exists only in his delusional mind. The table will be set with stolen silverware. The wine will flow from cellars looted across occupied Europe, and the menu promises delicacies that most Germans have not tasted in years. These men, architects of terror who spent the war years dragging families from their homes in the middle of the night, who signed deportation orders over breakfast and torture warrants over lunch, are about to sit down for what they believe will be a triumphant meal. They have no idea that their cook has other plans. Her name is Rosa Schneider, though that is not the name she was born with. She is 42 years old, thin as a rail from years of rationing, with work-hardened hands and eyes that seem to look through you rather than at you. To the Gestapo officers, she is invisible. She is the woman who appears at dawn to light the stoves, who scrubs the blood from their uniform collars without comment, who serves their meals in silence and vanishes back into the kitchen like a ghost. They do not know that before the war, she ran a small restaurant in the Jewish quarter of Berlin with her husband, a place known for its warm atmosphere and her exceptional mushroom dishes. They do not know that in 1938, during Kristallnacht, brown shirts smashed every window of her establishment while police stood by and laughed. They do not know that her husband, who was not Jewish but who had many Jewish friends, and who refused to hang a portrait of the Führer in their dining room, was arrested 3 weeks later on fabricated charges of defeatism. They especially do not know that he died in Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1940, beaten to death by guards for the crime of sharing his bread ration with another prisoner. Rosa has been working in this villa for 8 months. She was assigned here by the local labor office after her restaurant was permanently shuttered and her assets seized by the state. Every morning, she walks through rooms decorated with paintings stolen from murdered families. Every afternoon, she overhears conversations about quotas and transports and liquidations, spoken in the same casual tone men might use to discuss the weather. Every evening, she serves dinner to men whose signatures appear on documents that destroyed thousands of lives. She has learned their habits, their preferences, their schedules. She knows that the commander likes his meat rare and his vegetables overcooked. She knows that the deputy chief has a weakness for anything with cream sauce. She knows that they trust her completely because they do not believe a middle-aged German woman could possibly pose any threat to them. In their universe, danger comes from partisans in the forest, from saboteurs with bombs, from enemy soldiers with rifles. Danger does not come from the kitchen, and it certainly does not come from a cook who bows her head and says yes, sir, and no, sir, and never meets their eyes. But Rosa has been waiting. She has been patient in a way that only someone who has lost everything can be patient. She has memorized the faces of every officer who dines at this table. She has watched them grow fat on stolen food while the city starves. She has listened to them laugh about things that should make human beings weep. And she has been planning, carefully and methodically, for the one opportunity that would allow her to act. That opportunity has finally arrived in the form of this farewell dinner, this grand meal that the commander has ordered to boost morale before the retreat. He has given her a generous budget and told her to prepare something memorable, something worthy of officers of the Reich. He has specifically requested that she prepare her specialty, the dish that the villa's previous German staff mentioned she was known for before the war. He wants her famous mushroom ragout. The forests around Berlin are full of mushrooms in early spring. Some are delicious and nutritious, prized by foragers who know where to look. Others are toxic, causing stomach upset and discomfort, but rarely death. And then there are the Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushrooms, which look remarkably similar to edible varieties if you do not know exactly what to look for. They are among the most poisonous organisms on Earth. A single cap contains enough amatoxin to kill an adult human. The poison cannot be destroyed by cooking. It has no taste, no smell. Symptoms do not appear for 6 to 12 hours after ingestion, long after the toxin has begun its irreversible work of destroying the liver and kidneys. By the time a victim realizes something is wrong, it is far too late for any antidote. Medical intervention is largely futile. The mortality rate is approximately 70%, and those who survive often require liver transplants. Rosa knows all of this because before the war, she was famous not just for cooking mushrooms, but for her expertise in identifying them. She taught classes on mushroom foraging. She wrote articles for culinary magazines about the importance of proper identification. She knows exactly what she is looking for, and she knows exactly where to find it. 3 days before the dinner, Rosa walks into the forest on her afternoon off. She carries a basket and moves slowly through the undergrowth, searching. The other kitchen staff think she is gathering ingredients for the feast. The Gestapo guards who see her leave think nothing of it because she has made this walk dozens of times before, always returning with mushrooms or herbs or wild greens that she incorporates into meals. But this time, Rosa is not looking for food. She is looking for justice. She is looking for weapons that grow silently in the damp earth beneath the trees. And when she finds them, growing in a dark cluster beneath an old oak tree, she kneels down and begins to harvest them with the care and precision of someone who knows exactly what she is holding. The death caps go into her basket, wrapped carefully in cloth. She takes enough for 8 servings, maybe 9. She takes enough to make sure that when these men sit down to their farewell dinner, it will truly be a farewell. The villa kitchen on the morning of the dinner is a carefully orchestrated performance of normalcy. Rosa arrives before dawn as always, unlocking the service entrance with the key they gave her months ago, another small symbol of their absolute trust in her invisibility. The other kitchen staff, 2 older German women who were also assigned here by the Labor Office, arrive an hour later and immediately begin their tasks without much conversation. They are exhausted, ground down by years of war and rationing and fear. They do their work and ask no questions, because questions in 1945 Germany are dangerous luxuries that ordinary people cannot afford. Rosa moves through the kitchen with her usual quiet efficiency, pulling out pots and pans, checking the pantry inventory, reviewing the menu she has planned. To anyone watching, she is simply a cook preparing for an important meal. But in the cloth bag she carried from her small apartment this morning, wrapped in layers of newspaper at the bottom beneath legitimate cooking supplies, are the death cap mushrooms she harvested 3 days ago. They have been drying in her apartment, hidden in a hat box in her closet, waiting for this moment. The menu she has designed is deliberately elaborate, a final feast that will keep the officers at the table for hours. She will start them with a soup course, a simple potato and leek preparation that will prime their appetites. Then will come the main event, her signature dish, wild mushroom ragu served over fresh egg noodles with herbs from the villa garden and accompanied by roasted root vegetables. For dessert, she has planned an apple strudel with cream, using the last of the hoarded sugar and butter that the commander's wife has been saving for a special occasion. The other cooks have been assigned to handle the soup and the dessert. Rosa has insisted, with unusual firmness that surprised even herself, that she will personally prepare the mushroom course. She explained that it is a complex dish requiring specific timing and technique, that the mushrooms must be handled just right to bring out their full flavor. The other women were happy to let her take on the most difficult preparation. They have watched her make variations of this dish dozens of times over the past months whenever mushrooms were available. They have no reason to suspect that tonight's version will be any different from all the others. Around mid-morning, Rosa sends the other cooks out to the garden to harvest the herbs and vegetables they will need. She tells them to take their time, to select only the best specimens because tonight everything must be perfect. The moment they disappear through the kitchen door, she moves quickly. From her bag, she retrieves the death caps, still wrapped in their newspaper cocoon. She sets them on her personal cutting board, the one she brought from home and keeps separate from the villa's equipment. With her sharpest knife, she begins to clean them, removing any remaining dirt, trimming the stems, separating the caps. Her hands are steady. She has done this 1,000 times with edible mushrooms, and the physical motions are identical. Only the intention has changed. She works quickly but carefully, knowing she has perhaps 15 minutes before the others return. The death caps go into a separate bowl, distinct from the porcini and chanterelles she legitimately purchased at the market yesterday. Those edible mushrooms, expensive and beautiful, will serve a purpose too. They will be mixed with the toxic ones, camouflaging them, making visual identification impossible once everything is cooked down into the ragout. The preparation of the sauce begins in early afternoon. Rosa starts with butter in a heavy pan, adding shallots that she minces so fine they nearly dissolve into the fat. The smell begins to fill the kitchen, rich and promising. She adds white wine, good French wine from the commander's personal collection that he specifically told her to use liberally. As the alcohol reduces and the shallots soften into golden translucency, she begins adding the mushrooms in stages. First go the edible ones, the porcini and chanterelles, their earthy aroma blooming in the heat. The other cooks, working on their assigned tasks nearby, occasionally glance over and nod with approval. The dish smells exactly as it should, exactly as it has every other time Rosa has prepared it. Then, with her body positioned to block their view, Rosa adds the death caps. They look almost identical to the edible varieties once they hit the pan. They sizzle and reduce and mingle with the others. The amatoxin within them, stable at any temperature, patient and permanent, waits. She adds cream, adds herbs, adds a touch more wine. She tastes the sauce from a spoon, but only the liquid portion, carefully avoiding any pieces of mushroom. The flavor is perfect, complex and rich. Everything is exactly as it should be. Everything is proceeding according to plan. By late afternoon, the dining room has been transformed. The long mahogany table, stolen from this house's original owners, has been set with formal place settings for 9 officers. Crystal glasses catch the light from the chandelier overhead. The commander's wife has even brought out white linens that have been hoarded since before the war began. In the kitchen, Rosa plates the final elements of the meal with artistic precision. The mushroom ragout sits in its warming pot, aromatic and deadly. The noodles are cooked perfectly al dente. The vegetables are golden and caramelized. In less than an hour, the officers will arrive, will take their seats, will be served the first course. They will drink and laugh and toast to their continued survival. They will compliment the food and demand seconds. They will have no idea that their cook, the invisible middle-aged woman they have never truly seen, has just sentenced them to death. And Rosa, standing in the kitchen in her stained apron with her work-worn hands, feels something she has not felt since 1940 when they told her that her husband was dead. She feels a sense of purpose. She feels for the first time in 5 years like she has some small measure of control over the chaos that destroyed her life. The officers begin arriving at 7 o'clock sharp, their boots echoing through the marble hallway as they strip off their coats and hand them to the house staff. Rosa can hear them from the kitchen, their voices loud and jovial, already loosened by whatever drinks they consumed before arriving. The commander is holding court, his booming laugh cutting through the conversations as he describes some administrative triumph from earlier in the week. These are not combat soldiers. None of these men have seen a battlefield in years, if ever. They are bureaucrats of terror, paper pushers who orchestrated genocide from behind desks, men whose weapons were typewriters and filing systems and lists of names. But they wear their black uniforms with silver insignia, as though they conquered nations personally, as though the medals on their chests represent valor rather than years of service, sending others to die. Rosa watches through the service door as they settle into their seats, watches as the commander takes his position at the head of the table. She notes who sits where, memorizing the arrangement. The deputy chief is to the commander's right, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who she knows personally approved deportation quotas for 3 districts. To his left is the transportation officer who coordinated the trains, who solved the logistical puzzles of moving thousands of people to camps in Poland. The others fan out down the table, each one responsible for some specific aspect of the machinery of death that operated in this region for years. The first course goes out without incident. The potato and leek soup is received with polite appreciation and consumed quickly. The officers are hungry, their conversation flowing easily between mouthfuls. They discuss the military situation with delusional optimism, repeating propaganda about secret wonder weapons that will turn the tide of the war. They complain about the unreliability of foreign laborers and the incompetence of Wehrmacht generals who failed to hold the Eastern Front. They speculate about their next postings, assuming with bizarre confidence that there will be next postings, that the Reich will somehow survive the Soviet armies currently surrounding Berlin. Rosa clears the soup bowls herself, moving around the table in silence, her presence so expected and unremarkable that several officers continue their conversations without pause, even as she reaches between them. One man, the youngest at the table, perhaps 30 years old, makes a crude joke about Russian women as Rosa removes his bowl. The others laugh. She keeps her face blank, her movements efficient. She is a piece of furniture to them, no more worthy of consideration than the chairs they sit on. Back in the kitchen, the moment has arrived. Rosa arranges 9 plates in a precise line on the preparation counter. The egg noodles go down first, a generous portion on each plate, steaming and butter-slicked. Then comes the ragu, ladled with careful equality, making sure each serving contains an identical amount of the mushroom mixture. She garnishes each plate with fresh parsley and a small grinding of black pepper. The presentation is beautiful restaurant quality, the kind of dish that would have earned praise in her establishment before the war. The other kitchen staff watch her work with something like admiration, commenting on how professional everything looks. One of them mentions that it is a shame such good food is wasted on men who barely taste what they eat, who shovel down meals while discussing business. Rosa does not respond. She is counting portions in her head, doing mathematics of death. Each plate contains approximately 3 ounces of the mushroom mixture. Within that mixture, the ratio is roughly 1 part death cap to 2 parts edible mushrooms. It is more than enough. It is in fact overkill in the most literal sense, but Rosa is taking no chances. She has spent 8 months planning this moment, and she will not fail because of insufficient dosage. She loads the plates onto a serving cart, the wheels squeaking slightly as she pushes it toward the dining room. Through the service door, she can see the officers are in high spirits now, the wine having elevated their mood even further. The commander is telling some story about the early days of the war, about the ease of their initial victories in Poland. The others are listening with the half attention of men who have heard this story before, but know their role is to laugh at the appropriate moments. Rosa enters the dining room and begins serving from the left, placing each plate with the same careful precision she used in plating them. The first officer to receive his meal immediately picks up his fork and digs in without waiting for the others. By the time Rosa has circled the table and placed the final plate before the commander, 3 of the men are already eating. The commander raises his wineglass and proposes a toast to German resilience, to their shared service, to the certainty of ultimate victory. The men raise their glasses, drink deeply, and then turn their attention to the food before them. Rosa hears the first compliment before she even reaches the kitchen door. The meal progresses exactly as Rosa anticipated. The officers devour the mushroom ragu with enthusiastic appreciation, several requesting second helpings, which Rosa provides from the pot she kept warming in the kitchen. The commander himself summons her to the dining room to personally congratulate her on the dish, telling her it is the finest thing he has eaten in months. He asks where she sourced such excellent mushrooms in the middle of a war. Rosa tells him the truth in the most technical sense, that she foraged them herself from the forests outside the city, that she knows the best spots from years of experience. He nods approvingly and dismisses her with a wave. By 8:30, every plate has been cleared, every trace of the ragu consumed. The officers lean back in their chairs, satisfied and drowsy with food and wine. The dessert course is served, the apple strudel disappearing almost as quickly as the main course. By 9 o'clock, the dinner is winding down. Some of the officers are smoking cigars, others are drinking cognac from the commander's private reserve. They are relaxed, content, completely unaware that the toxin is already beginning its silent work in their digestive systems, that the amatoxin molecules are already binding to their cells, that the countdown to their deaths has already begun. Rosa leaves the villa at 10 o'clock, the same time she always leaves after evening events. The commander's wife dismisses her with barely a glance, too focused on managing the serving of after-dinner drinks to pay attention to the cook. Rosa walks through the service entrance into the cold night air, her cloth bag over her shoulder, her coat buttoned against the spring chill. Behind her, through the illuminated windows of the dining room, she can still see the officers gathered around the table, their silhouettes animated by conversation and alcohol. They will remain there for hours yet, drinking and smoking and congratulating themselves on their survival while the city burns around them. She does not look back for long. She has a 20-minute walk to her small apartment in a building that somehow survived the bombing raids, and she needs to be home and in bed at her usual time. Routine is everything now. Any deviation from her normal pattern could draw attention, and attention is the last thing she can afford. As she walks through streets darkened by blackout regulations, past buildings reduced to rubble, past refugees huddled in doorways, Rosa feels a strange calm settling over her. She has done what she set out to do. The rest is simply waiting. The symptoms will begin around 3 or 4 in the morning if her calculations are correct. The initial phase of amatoxin poisoning mimics common food poisoning, violent enough to be alarming, but not yet indicative of the catastrophe unfolding at the cellular level. The officers will wake with severe abdominal cramps, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. They will assume at first that something in the meal disagreed with them, perhaps the richness of the cream sauce or the quantity of wine they consumed. Some might blame the cook's hygiene, might mutter about foreign workers and declining standards, but they will not suspect poison, not real poison, because food poisoning is common enough in wartime Germany, where refrigeration is unreliable and ingredients are often questionable. They will suffer through the night, miserable but not yet terrified. Then, around dawn, the symptoms will mysteriously improve. This is the latent phase, the cruel trick that amatoxin plays on its victims. For 12 to 24 hours they will feel better. They will think they are recovering. The commander might even joke about his iron constitution, about surviving worse than a bad mushroom. But during this deceptive calm, the poison will be doing its real work, destroying liver cells, shutting down kidneys, causing irreversible damage that no doctor in Berlin or anywhere else can repair. Rosa reaches her apartment building and climbs 3 flights of stairs to her small room. It contains almost nothing now, just a narrow bed, a table, a chair, a small stove. Everything valuable was sold or seized years ago. She undresses mechanically, folds her clothes and lies down in the darkness. Sleep does not come easily despite her exhaustion. Her mind replays the evening over and over, searching for mistakes, for anything that might have given her away. Did she act normally enough? Did any of the kitchen staff notice anything unusual? Did she portion the mushrooms evenly, or did some officers receive more than others? She thinks about the commander complimenting her cooking, about how he smiled at her with the same casual authority he probably used when signing death warrants. She thinks about the youngest officer, the one who made the crude joke, and wonders if he has a wife, children. Then she stops herself. She cannot afford sympathy now. These men destroyed thousands of families without hesitation or remorse. They processed human beings like paperwork, reducing lives to numbers and transport schedules. Whatever families they have, whatever futures they might have had, they forfeited the moment they chose to serve the machinery of genocide. The next morning arrives grey and cold. Rosa wakes at her usual hour, dresses in her usual clothes, and walks the same route to the villa she has walked for 8 months. Her heart is pounding as she approaches, but her face remains carefully neutral. She does not know what she will find. Part of her expects to see ambulances, chaos, some visible indication that the night went badly for the Gestapo officers. But the villa looks exactly as it always does, quiet and imposing behind its iron gate. She lets herself in through the service entrance and finds the kitchen staff already there, looking shaken. One of the women, the older one who usually handles the soup courses, turns to Rosa with wide eyes and explains in a hushed whisper that all the officers from last night's dinner became violently ill in the early morning hours. The commander's wife is in a fury, has already called for doctors, has been ranting about food poisoning and incompetence. Rosa allows her face to register appropriate shock and concern. She asks careful questions. Which officers were affected? All of them, she is told. Every single man who attended the dinner. Were any of the household staff ill? No, just the officers. The kitchen woman speculates that perhaps the mushrooms were not fresh, or perhaps they were cleaned improperly, though she is quick to add that she is not blaming Rosa specifically, that these things happen in wartime. The villa throughout the day becomes a scene of controlled panic. Doctors come and go, black bags in hand, their expressions grave. Rosa continues her work, preparing simple meals for the household staff and the commander's wife, who is too distraught to eat. By afternoon, Rosa learns through kitchen gossip that the officers are feeling better, that the doctors diagnosed acute gastroenteritis and prescribed rest and bland foods. The commander's wife has decided not to report the incident to higher authorities because it would reflect poorly on her household management, and because in the chaos of the collapsing Reich, 9 officers with stomach troubles is hardly a priority. Rosa nods along with this news, expressing relief that the situation is resolving. Inside she feels nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, no triumph. Just a hollow certainty that the latent phase is proceeding exactly as the medical literature she once read described. In another day, perhaps less, the officers will enter the final phase. Their livers will fail, their kidneys will shut down, they will bleed internally as their blood loses its ability to clot, and there will be nothing anyone can do to save them. The second night passes in tense waiting. Rosa lies in her narrow bed listening to distant artillery, closer now than it was yesterday, and wonders if any of the officers are lying awake too, feeling the first hints that something is terribly wrong. The medical texts she studied years ago when she was writing her mushroom identification articles were clear about the timeline. After the latent phase, the symptoms return with devastating force. Jaundice appears as the liver fails. The skin turns yellow, the eyes follow. Internal bleeding begins, manifesting as blood in vomit and stool. Confusion sets in as toxins the liver can no longer process flood the brain. By the 3rd or 4th day after ingestion, most victims slip into hepatic coma. Death follows shortly after, sometimes mercifully quick, sometimes agonizingly slow. There is no antidote. There is no treatment beyond supportive care that rarely makes a difference. In 1945 Berlin, with hospitals overwhelmed by war casualties and medical supplies nearly exhausted, even that limited care will be hard to obtain. Rosa knows this. She planned for this. She is counting on the chaos of the collapsing Reich to camouflage 9 deaths among thousands. The call comes early on the 3rd morning. Rosa is barely through the villa's service entrance when the commander's wife intercepts her, face pale and drawn. The officers are much worse, she explains in a tight voice. The improvement was temporary. Now they are deteriorating rapidly, all of them, in ways that make no medical sense. Some are bleeding, some are delirious, some have fallen unconscious. The doctors are baffled. Food poisoning does not progress like this. One physician mentioned the possibility of poison, actual poison, but was immediately shouted down by the commander's wife, who refuses to believe anyone in her household could be responsible for such a thing. She has decided it must be some exotic disease, perhaps something the officers contracted elsewhere, and the timing with the dinner was coincidental. She needs Rosa and the other kitchen staff to account for every ingredient used in the meal, to provide receipts and sources. Rosa complies calmly, producing her market receipts for the edible mushrooms, explaining her foraging locations in the forest. She even offers to take them to the exact spots where she gathered the wild mushrooms, knowing they will find nothing incriminating there now. The death caps grew in one specific location, and she harvested them completely. Any residual evidence is long gone. By afternoon, ambulances begin arriving. The officers are being transported to military hospitals, though Rosa overhears one doctor confiding to another that there is little point, that whatever is destroying their livers is too far advanced for intervention. The villa becomes eerily quiet as the last patients are carried out on stretchers, some conscious and moaning, others already unconscious. Rosa watches from the kitchen window as the deputy chief, the thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who approved deportation quotas, is loaded into an ambulance. His skin is the color of an old bruise, yellow-gray and waxy. His eyes are open but unfocused, staring at nothing. She feels no satisfaction watching this, But she feels no regret either. This is simply cause and effect, action and consequence. These men authored horrors for years, and now horror has found them. The arithmetic of justice is being balanced, one death at a time. The commander dies first on the evening of the third day. Word spreads through the villa staff in whispers. Liver failure, the doctors said, complete organ shutdown. The commander's wife collapses in grief and has to be sedated. Rosa learns this while preparing a simple soup that no one will eat. By the fourth day, 3 more officers are dead. By the 5th day, the count rises to 7. The remaining 2 linger in comas, their bodies fighting battles they cannot win. The military authorities are finally taking notice now, sending investigators to determine what killed so many officers in the same location at the same time. But the investigators are overwhelmed, working in a city under siege, trying to solve a mystery when the Reich itself is dying around them. They interview the kitchen staff, including Rosa. She tells the truth in carefully measured portions. Yes, she prepared the mushroom dish. Yes, she foraged some of the mushrooms herself. Yes, she has extensive experience with mushroom identification. No, she has never made a mistake before. No, she did not notice anything unusual about the mushrooms she used. Could she have accidentally harvested something toxic? The investigator asked this directly, watching her face. Rosa meets his eyes and says it is possible, that even experts can make mistakes in dim forest light, that she would never forgive herself if her error caused this tragedy. The investigator writes down her answers in a notebook, but Rosa can see he is not really invested in finding the truth. Berlin will fall within weeks, perhaps days. The entire Nazi apparatus is dissolving. 9 dead Gestapo officers, while unusual, are simply 9 more casualties in a war that has produced millions. The investigator thanks her for her cooperation and leaves. Rosa never sees him again. By the 6th day, the final 2 officers die within hours of each other. All 9 men who sat at that dinner table are now dead. The official cause is listed as accidental poisoning due to misidentified mushrooms, a tragic mistake by an otherwise competent cook. The commander's wife, grief-stricken and facing the imminent Soviet occupation alone, leaves Berlin. The villa is abandoned. The kitchen staff is dismissed. Rosa collects her final wages, a handful of increasingly worthless Reichsmarks, and walks out of the building for the last time. She does not look back. Behind her, the house stands empty, a monument to a regime in its final death throes, haunted by the ghosts of men who died choking on their own blood because a middle-aged cook decided that 8 months of serving them in silence was enough. The Red Army enters Berlin on April 21, 1945, just 16 days after the dinner party. Rosa watches from her apartment window as Soviet tanks roll through streets littered with rubble and bodies, as soldiers move methodically through buildings, searching for resistance fighters and Nazi officials. The city that once proclaimed itself the heart of a 1,000-year Reich is now a smoking ruin, its population starving and terrified, its infrastructure destroyed. In the chaos of those final weeks, 9 dead Gestapo officers are forgotten almost immediately. There are no funerals, no ceremonies, no investigations that lead anywhere. The men simply disappear into the statistical void of the war's end, their names buried in paperwork that will be lost or destroyed in the coming months. Rosa survives the occupation by making herself useful, cooking for Soviet officers in the same villa where she poisoned their German predecessors. The irony is not lost on her, but survival requires flexibility. She prepares borscht and pelmeni instead of schnitzel and strudel, serves vodka instead of wine, and once again becomes invisible furniture to men in uniform who discuss matters of occupation and politics over meals. The truth about the dinner never comes out, not officially. In the immediate post-war period, there are bigger crimes to prosecute, more significant Nazis to hunt. The Nuremberg trials focus on the architects of the Holocaust, the generals and ministers and administrators who operated at the highest levels. Local Gestapo officers, even entire units of them, often escape justice simply because the scale of Nazi crimes is too vast to address comprehensively. The 9 men Rosa killed would likely have faced trial eventually, if they had lived, but they also might have slipped through the cracks, might have reinvented themselves in the post-war chaos like so many others did. Rosa ensures they faced at least one form of justice, immediate and irreversible, delivered not by an international tribunal, but by a woman they never bothered to see as human. She never confesses. She never tells anyone what she did. Confession would serve no purpose except to satisfy some abstract moral requirement, and Rosa stopped caring about abstractions the day her husband died in a concentration camp. She keeps her secret locked away, continuing her life in occupied Berlin, eventually opening a small restaurant again in the 1950s when the city begins to rebuild. Years pass, decades pass. Rosa grows old in a divided Berlin, watching the wall go up in 1961, watching the Cold War transform her city into a symbol of global tension. She never marries again. She has no children. Her restaurant becomes known for its traditional German cooking, and yes, she still serves mushroom dishes, though she is scrupulously careful about identification and sources. Regular customers sometimes ask her about the war years, about how she survived, but she deflects these questions with vague generalities about hardship and hunger, and the relief of peace. Only once in the late 1960s does she come close to revealing the truth. A young journalist writing a book about civilian resistance during the war tracks her down because old records show she worked in a villa where multiple Gestapo officers died mysteriously near the war's end. He asks if she remembers anything unusual, any suspicious circumstances. Rosa, now in her 60s with grey hair and arthritic hands, looks at him across her restaurant table and tells him it was food poisoning, a tragic accident with wild mushrooms, nothing more. The journalist writes down her answer and moves on to other stories. The book, when published, dedicates half a paragraph to the incident, noting it as an example of how chaotic conditions in late war Berlin led to unusual deaths. Rosa dies in 1978 at the age of 75. Her obituary in the local paper is brief, noting her as a respected restaurateur and a survivor of the war years. There is no mention of resistance, no acknowledgement of what she did. Her small estate, mostly the restaurant and its equipment, is liquidated. Among her personal effects, distant relatives find nothing unusual. No diary, no confession, no evidence of the calculated act of vengeance she carried out 33 years earlier. The secret dies with her, or so it seems, for decades. The story might have remained buried forever. Just another untold tale from a war full of untold tales, except for one detail Rosa could not have anticipated. In the early 2000s, a German historian researching Gestapo operations in Berlin discovers anomalous death records from April 1945. 9 officers from the same unit, all dying within days of each other, all from the same cause. The official explanation of accidental mushroom poisoning seems plausible at first, but the historian notices something odd. The timing is too perfect, the victims too specific, and the mushroom expert who allegedly made the mistake had an impeccable record before and after the incident. The historian begins digging deeper, tracking down old records, interviewing anyone still alive who might remember. Most of the kitchen staff from the villa are long dead, but he finds one, now in her 90s, living in a nursing home. Her memory is fragmentary, but she remembers Rosa clearly. She remembers how insistent Rosa was about preparing the mushroom dish personally, how she sent the other cooks out of the kitchen at a critical moment, how she seemed strangely calm when news of the officer's illness broke. The old woman also remembers, and this is the critical detail, that Rosa's husband had died in a concentration camp, that Rosa had every reason to hate the Gestapo, and that Rosa was an expert in mushrooms who would never make an identification error by accident. The historian interviews more people, reviews more documents, and slowly pieces together what really happened. He cannot prove it absolutely because Rosa left no evidence, but the circumstantial case is overwhelming. He publishes his findings in a scholarly journal in 2007, 62 years after the dinner. The article is titled, "An Act of Culinary Resistance, the Case of the Berlin Mushroom Poisonings." It makes a minor splash in academic circles, but largely goes unnoticed by the general public. The story begins to spread slowly through historical communities and eventually reaches wider audiences through documentaries and podcasts dedicated to untold stories of World War II. What makes Rosa's case particularly compelling is not just the audacity of the act itself, but what it represents about resistance in its quietest, most personal form. The grand narratives of the war focus on military operations, on partisan groups blowing up trains, on organized resistance networks, smuggling refugees and intelligence. But Rosa's story illuminates a different kind of courage, the courage of an individual acting entirely alone, without support or coordination, using the only weapon available to her. She was not a soldier or a spy. She was a middle-aged cook with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Her resistance was not strategic in any military sense. Killing 9 local Gestapo officers did not shorten the war by a single day or save a single life in the camps, but it mattered anyway because it was an assertion of human dignity in a system designed to destroy dignity, a refusal to accept powerlessness even when power seemed absolute. Modern toxicology experts who review the case confirm that Rosa's method would have been devastatingly effective. Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushroom, remains one of the most reliably lethal poisons available in nature. It requires no processing, no extraction, no special preparation. Simply cooking and eating the mushrooms is sufficient to deliver a fatal dose. The symptoms Rosa would have anticipated match exactly what the historical medical records describe for the 9 officers. The initial gastric distress, the deceptive recovery period, the sudden catastrophic organ failure. Every detail aligns with classic amatoxin poisoning. What makes her plan so brilliant from a tactical standpoint is the built-in deniability. Accidental mushroom poisoning happens. Even experts make mistakes, especially in wartime conditions when people are stressed and hungry and perhaps not as careful as they should be. Rosa could claim accident because accidents are plausible, and in the chaos of April 1945, no one had the time or resources to prove otherwise. She understood that the perfect crime is not one that leaves no evidence, but one that leaves evidence pointing to a believable alternative explanation. The ethical questions surrounding Rosa's actions are complex and have no easy answers. She was not acting in immediate self-defense. She was not preventing imminent harm. She was exacting revenge for past crimes, administering a death sentence without trial or due process. In a legal sense, what she did was murder, 9 counts of premeditated homicide, but the law assumes a functioning justice system, and by April 1945, no such system existed in Nazi Germany. The courts that operated under the Third Reich were instruments of oppression, not justice. They sent innocent people to death camps while protecting the guilty. So what recourse did someone like Rosa have? What options existed for a civilian woman who wanted to see justice done against men who operated with complete impunity? The answer is none. She had no legal options, no peaceful options, no options that would satisfy any conventional moral framework. She could accept powerlessness and watch her husband's murderers drink champagne and laugh, or she could act. She chose to act. Some modern commentators argue that Rosa's actions were justified by the extraordinary circumstances of the Holocaust, that normal ethical constraints cannot apply in the face of genocidal evil. Others maintain that murder is murder regardless of the victim, that Rosa lowered herself to the level of the men she killed by taking lives without trial. But this debate, while intellectually interesting, misses something essential about Rosa herself. She did not agonize over philosophical questions or seek validation from future generations. She was not making a statement about resistance theory or testing the boundaries of justified violence. She was a woman who lost her husband to state-sanctioned murder, who spent 8 months serving meals to men who represented that murderous state, and who finally decided that she could not continue doing so without acting. Whether her actions were right or wrong in some absolute sense mattered less to her than the simple fact that they were necessary for her own survival, for her own sense of self. She could not live with herself if she remained passive, so she stopped being passive. The historical record shows that the 9 officers Rosa killed were not minor functionaries. They were senior administrators in the local Gestapo apparatus, men with significant authority and blood on their hands. The deputy chief alone was documented as having approved deportation orders affecting thousands of people. The transportation officer coordinated the logistics that moved those people to camps. The others held positions that directly contributed to the machinery of the Holocaust. These were not innocent bystanders or reluctant participants. They were enthusiastic servants of a genocidal regime who continued their work until the moment the regime collapsed around them. Rosa did not poison random German soldiers or low-level clerks. She targeted men who wielded real power and caused real harm. In the calculus of wartime justice, as imperfect and troubling as that concept is, her victims were among the most guilty. The fact that they never faced official prosecution, that they might have escaped justice entirely if they had survived, adds another layer to the moral equation. Rosa ensured they faced consequences, even if those consequences came from an unexpected source and took an unconventional form. What remains most striking about Rosa's story when examined in detail is the sheer nerve it required to execute. The planning phase alone demanded extraordinary discipline. She had to maintain her cover as the compliant, invisible cook for 8 months while waiting for the right opportunity, all while surrounded by men trained to detect deception and disloyalty. Every day she walked into that villa, she was in mortal danger. If the Gestapo had suspected her of anything, even simple insubordination, they could have arrested her without charges, tortured her without oversight, killed her without consequence. The villa itself was a house of horrors where these things happened regularly. Rosa would have heard screams from interrogation sessions, would have seen prisoners brought in and dragged out. Yet she maintained her composure, performed her duties, and waited for her moment with the patience of someone who understood that premature action meant certain death. The psychological strength required to sustain that performance for months, to smile politely at men she despised, to cook their meals day after day while planning to kill them, suggests a level of self-control that borders on superhuman. The actual execution of the plan required not just nerve but precise technical knowledge. Rosa had to harvest the death cap mushrooms at the right time, in the right conditions, and in sufficient quantity without being observed or leaving evidence. She had to store them properly so they retained their toxicity, but did not rot or become obviously dangerous. She had to integrate them into a dish in a way that made detection impossible, mixing them with legitimate edible mushrooms so that visual inspection would reveal nothing suspicious. She had to calculate dosages carefully, ensuring each officer received enough poison to guarantee death, but not so much that the taste or texture became unusual. And she had to do all of this while working in a kitchen with other staff present, while maintaining her normal routine, while showing no signs of stress or unusual behavior. One mistake at any stage would have exposed her. One moment of visible nervousness, one incorrect mushroom ratio, one officer who ate less than the others and survived to report suspicions, and everything would have collapsed. The margin for error was essentially zero, yet Rosa executed flawlessly. The aftermath required perhaps even more nerve than the act itself. Rosa had to return to work the next day and face the consequences of what she had done, had to watch the officers fall ill and die, while maintaining a facade of shock and concern. She had to be interviewed by investigators, had to answer questions about her mushroom expertise, had to offer plausible explanations while knowing that a single slip of the tongue could result in her arrest and execution. The natural human response to causing 9 deaths, even justified deaths, is emotional turmoil. Guilt, fear, triumph, horror. These emotions would have been overwhelming for most people. But Rosa could not afford to display any of them. She had to be concerned, but not suspiciously so, helpful but not overly eager, knowledgeable but not defensive. She had to perform grief for the commander's wife, who had just lost her husband. She had to exist in a state of constant alertness while appearing completely normal, and she maintained this performance not for days or weeks, but for the rest of her life. 33 years of keeping the secret, of never confessing even to close friends, of taking the truth to her grave. The psychological profile that emerges from Rosa's actions is fascinating and deeply human. She was not a sociopath incapable of empathy or remorse. The historical evidence suggests she was a normal woman with normal emotional responses, who was pushed into extraordinary circumstances. She loved her husband deeply, loved him enough that his murder transformed her into someone capable of calculated revenge. She was not reckless or impulsive. Everything about her plan demonstrates careful thought and risk assessment. She did not act out of blind rage, but out of a cold determination that justice needed to be served, and she was the only one in a position to serve it. After the war, she returned to a normal life, opened a restaurant, served her community, showed no signs of being haunted or destroyed by what she had done. This suggests she made peace with her actions, that she believed they were necessary and proportionate, that she felt no need for redemption or forgiveness. She was not seeking absolution from history. She was simply doing what needed to be done and then moving on with her life. Modern psychological research on resistance fighters and partisans from World War II reveals that many shared Rosa's profile. They were ordinary people, not soldiers or revolutionaries, who found themselves in situations where passivity felt like collaboration and action felt like the only moral choice. What separated them from their neighbors who remained passive was not superior courage or stronger principles, but a specific combination of personal loss, opportunity, and willingness to accept risk. Rosa had lost everything that mattered to her. She had access to the targets through her position as cook, and she possessed specialized knowledge that made action possible. Remove any one of these factors, and the story never happens. She needed the loss to provide motivation, the access to provide opportunity, and the knowledge to provide means. The convergence of all three in one person at one time was statistically rare, which is why individual acts of resistance like hers were uncommon. But when that convergence occurred, it produced outcomes that rippled through history, even if they went unrecognized for decades. The broader implications of Rosa's story extend far beyond one woman and 9 dead Gestapo officers. Her case challenges fundamental assumptions about power, resistance, and who gets to be remembered as a hero. The traditional narrative of World War II resistance centers on armed fighters, on dramatic sabotage operations, on organized networks with code names and radio operators. These stories are easier to tell and easier to celebrate because they fit conventional frameworks of what heroism looks like. But Rosa's story is quieter, more intimate, and in some ways more unsettling, because it forces us to confront the reality that effective resistance can come from the most unexpected places and take the most unexpected forms. A middle-aged cook using her culinary expertise to poison her employers does not fit the Hollywood version of a resistance fighter. There are no gunfights, no daring escapes, no coded messages hidden in loaves of bread. Just a woman who knew mushrooms and knew hatred and combined the two with devastating precision. The fact that Rosa's story remained hidden for over 60 years also reveals something important about how history is recorded and who gets included in it. The immediate post-war period focused on documenting major crimes and prosecuting major criminals. Local acts of resistance, especially those carried out by women in domestic roles, were often overlooked or dismissed as insignificant. Rosa was not part of an organized network that left records and testimony. She acted alone, told no one, and left no evidence. From a historical standpoint, she was invisible, which is exactly what she had been during the war itself. Only luck and the persistence of one historian decades later brought her story to light, which raises the obvious question of how many other stories remain buried. How many other acts of individual resistance happened that we will never know about because the people who carried them out chose silence or died before anyone thought to ask? The historical record is full of gaps, and those gaps are not random. They disproportionately erase the experiences of women, working-class people, and anyone who operated outside formal power structures. Rosa's choice to never reveal what she did also speaks to a pragmatic understanding of post-war politics. In the immediate aftermath of the war, German society was deeply conflicted about how to process its Nazi past. Many former Nazis integrated back into society, taking positions in government, business, and professional life. Denazification efforts were inconsistent and often superficial. In this environment, a woman who admitted to poisoning 9 Gestapo officers might have faced prosecution or at minimum social ostracism from a community trying to move forward rather than dwell on the past. Even if she avoided legal consequences, she would have become a symbol, someone forced to repeatedly justify and explain her actions, someone who could never escape being defined by one terrible night in April 1945. Rosa chose a different path. She chose normalcy, chose to rebuild her life without the weight of public knowledge, chose to be just another survivor in a city full of survivors. This decision was not cowardice. It was self-preservation and a refusal to let the war define her entire existence. The question of whether Rosa should have revealed her actions raises interesting ethical considerations about truth, justice, and historical memory. On one hand, her silence meant that 9 murders went officially unsolved, that the families of the dead officers never knew what really happened, that justice was not served in any conventional sense. On the other hand, what would revealing the truth have accomplished? The officers were already dead. Their crimes were already committed. Putting Rosa on trial would not have brought her husband back or helped anyone heal. It would simply have added another tragedy to a situation already saturated with tragedy. Her silence allowed her to live the rest of her life on her own terms, which might be viewed as a final act of resistance against a system that had tried to reduce her to nothing. The Nazis wanted her to be powerless, invisible, inconsequential. By acting against them, and then successfully hiding that action for the rest of her life, Rosa maintained control over her own narrative in a way that public confession would have destroyed. The legacy of Rosa's story in contemporary discussions about resistance and moral action is complex. She has become, for some, a symbol of justified revenge against evil. For others, she represents the moral compromises that war forces on ordinary people. For still others, she is a cautionary tale about the dangers of vigilante justice even against unambiguous villains. But perhaps the most important legacy is simply that her story exists at all, that it was recovered from obscurity and can now be told. It serves as a reminder that history is not just made by generals and politicians, that the most powerful acts are not always the most visible, and that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected hands. Rosa Schneider, if that was even her real name, was not a saint or a monster. She was a woman who lost everything, who found herself in a position to act, and who made a choice that she apparently never regretted. Whether we judge that choice as right or wrong says more about us and our own moral frameworks than it does about her. Today, Rosa's story circulates in the shadowy corners of World War II history, shared among those who seek out the forgotten footnotes and overlooked narratives that textbooks ignore. It appears in academic papers on civilian resistance, in podcasts dedicated to untold stories, in online forums where amateur historians debate the ethics of her actions. But it remains largely unknown to the general public, which is both a tragedy and somehow fitting. Rosa herself chose obscurity, chose to let her deed speak silently through the death certificates of 9 men rather than through her own testimony. In honoring her story now, we must balance the desire to celebrate her courage with respect for the anonymity she maintained. She was not seeking fame or historical recognition. She was seeking something much simpler and much more profound: the ability to look at herself in the mirror and know that she had not remained passive in the face of evil, that she had acted when action was possible, that her husband's death had been answered. The story of the farewell dinner with lethal mushrooms forces us to reconsider what we think we know about the Holocaust and resistance to it. The dominant narrative suggests that ordinary people were powerless against the Nazi machine, that resistance was only possible through organized military action or large-scale conspiracy. But Rosa proves that this narrative is incomplete. Power is never absolute, no matter how totalitarian the regime. There are always cracks, always vulnerabilities, always moments when the oppressor becomes vulnerable to the oppressed. The Gestapo officers who sat at that table believed themselves invincible. They had the power of the state behind them, the authority to arrest and kill without consequence, the confidence that comes from years of operating with impunity. But they also needed to eat, and they needed someone to cook their food, and in that simple human necessity lay a vulnerability they never recognized. Rosa found that crack in the armor and exploited it with surgical precision. Her story suggests that resistance is always possible if you are willing to accept the risks and consequences, if you can identify the enemy's weakness, and if you possess the skills and knowledge to exploit it. The fact that this story nearly disappeared entirely into the fog of history should trouble us. How many other Rosa Schneiders were there? How many other acts of quiet, devastating resistance occurred in Nazi Germany and occupied Europe that we will never know about because the people who carried them out chose silence or died before anyone documented their actions? The historical record privileges the visible, the organized, the documented. It captures the resistance fighters who left networks and papers and testimony, but it often misses the individuals who acted alone, who left no evidence, who took their secrets to unmarked graves. Rosa's story survived because one historian got curious about an anomaly in death records and decided to investigate. Without that curiosity, without that persistence, she would remain just another nameless cook who worked in a villa during the war. The lesson here is that history is fragile, that the stories we tell about the past are always incomplete, and that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For every Rosa we discover, there are likely dozens or hundreds we never will. What makes Rosa's story particularly relevant today is not just its historical interest, but what it teaches about moral action in impossible situations. We live in a time of renewed attention to questions of resistance, complicity, and individual responsibility in the face of injustice. Rosa's case offers no easy answers, but it provides a powerful example of someone who refused to accept that her circumstances exempted her from moral agency. She could have told herself that she was just a cook, that she had no power, that survival required collaboration. Many people in similar positions told themselves exactly that, and history does not judge them harshly for it. But Rosa made a different calculation. She decided that her skills, her knowledge, and her position gave her both opportunity and obligation. She decided that inaction was itself a choice and one she could not live with. This is not a comfortable lesson, because it implies that we all have more power and more responsibility than we typically acknowledge, that we cannot hide behind our apparent powerlessness when opportunities for action present themselves. The final truth about Rosa Schneider and her farewell dinner for the Gestapo is that it represents something the Nazis never understood and ultimately could not defeat. They built a system designed to strip people of their humanity, to reduce them to numbers and categories and objects to be processed. They believed that terror could create absolute obedience, that brutality could eliminate resistance, that power could be total if wielded without mercy. But they failed to account for the human capacity for memory, for love, for the refusal to be reduced to nothing. Rosa remembered her husband. She remembered what her life had been before they destroyed it. She remembered that she was a person with skills and dignity and the ability to choose her own actions, and when the opportunity came, she chose to act in the only way available to her, using the knowledge they never bothered to see as dangerous, because it belonged to a woman they never bothered to see as human. In that choice, in that quiet act of devastating resistance, Rosa Schneider won a small victory against the machinery of genocide. 9 men who helped operate that machinery died in agony because they underestimated a cook. That is her legacy. That is the story that deserves to be told, remembered, and never forgotten. The dinner party that ended with death, the mushrooms that delivered justice, the woman who served both and then walked away into history.